called Grecians. We are, after all, talking about a president who, when asked prior to his election in 2000, was asked by a journalist if he was comfortable with his lack of foreign policy experience, if he'd be able to deal with the world leaders he'd have to meet. I mean, did he, for example, ask the interviewer, know any of them? Did he know, for example, the name of the leader of Pakistan? President Bush paused for a minute. He said, yes, the general. And the journalist asked, well, can you be a little more specific? Maybe a name? And he thought again for a minute and he said, we just call him the general. This is the president who told Haaretz newspaper in Israel that God told him to strike Afghanistan, and so he had done it. And that God told him to attack Iraq, and therefore he had done it. He's hearing voices, the President of the United States. The alibi of every serial killer in history. Somebody was telling him to do it. No wonder he speaks in tongues. This is a real problem, which will be threaded through what I have to say this evening. That we have the misfortune to be in an era, first, where there's only one superpower, and second, when that superpower is a giant led by a man with the mind of a child. And that he happened to be in a double harness with a fanatic imperialist auxiliary in the form of Tony Blair. I mean, at least Bush has the excuse that he's an imbecile. What's Blair's excuse? He was sent to Oxford University entirely free of charge and given a student grant to enjoy it with, both of which he's removed from subsequent generations of British students. And we'll come back to him and his role in events later. But first, let me say how wonderful it is to be back in Durban. This is the second time I've been in this city. The first time was in 1985. I was one of the very few people on the left in Britain who was ever able to visit apartheid South Africa, because, of course, we maintained, as all civilized people around the world did, a stance of total boycott of the racist state of South Africa. But because I was working very closely with the ANC in London, I was asked by them to enter South Africa on a political mission for them. I operated undercover in the country for several weeks, moving from house to house, being driven from town to town. By the way, almost every house in which I lived was the house of a Jewish family supporting the struggle, supporting the African National Congress, supporting the struggle for freedom. And that's a point worth making, because if I'm not going to be anti-American tonight, nobody should confuse or allow others to confuse the trenchant criticisms I shall make tonight of Zionism as an idea and Israel as a state with any hatred of Jews or Judaism. You do not need to be a Zionist to be a Jew, and you definitely don't need to be a Jew to be a Zionist. As I always say, anybody that thinks George Bush likes Jews has never visited his golf club down in Texas, where they don't allow them. I moved around South Africa for several weeks, setting up projects with the United Democratic Front, opening channels, preparing for the input of finance to help what became the decisive part of the struggle to defeat racism in South Africa. It all went swimmingly until I got involved in some youthful foolishness outside Paulsmoor Hospital, where Mandela was incarcerated. At that time, we were posing for a picture beside a slogan on the wall, "Free Nelson Mandela," and the police swooped. We had to run away because we had names and addresses and photographs and so on. We jumped into the car. The police car chased us. It was joined by another, then another. Finally, they cornered us in Guguletu Township. I was taken to the police station, and I can still recall every detail of my first encounter with an inspector in the apartheid police. I can still see his face. I can still smell him, to be honest. He was wearing a green, crimpling, short-sleeved safari suit. He knows who he is. And I give him this last chance, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, to come forward and wash my feet before I leave South Africa tomorrow. He beat me about the station, punched me, kicked me, slapped me, cursed me, and I recall rather wimpishly repeating the mantra, "Please call the British ambassador," which he never did. Not that the British ambassador would have done much, because Britain under Margaret Thatcher was a pillar of the apartheid system. I was present when Margaret Thatcher declared Nelson Mandela to be a terrorist. I saw the young conservative politicians, many of whom now on the Tory front bench, sitting alongside David Cameron with their T-shirts saying, "Hang Nelson Mandela." Remember that when we come, as we will this evening, to discuss terrorism, this highly loaded and virtually meaningless term. I'm amazed how easily it trips from the lips of journalists in South Africa, including journalists who should know better, when they must know that the entirety of their current government were once regarded as terrorists, but that the real terrorists were the apartheid policemen and the apartheid politicians that Thatcher recognized and shook hands with and traded with. Anyway, I'm mentioning all of that because I want to make my own position clear. I was and am a supporter of the African National Congress. I was in the 1980s when they had many foes to the right of them and to the left of them. And you need to know that, because tonight I shall make some criticisms of them and some demands of them. And I wouldn't want to be confused with someone who wishes the ANC ill, because I do not. Now, yesterday in Johannesburg, I gave a lecture by video link-up with various places. It was all rather avant-garde for me. I'm an older man. I'm not used to speaking to people I can't see. I don't even know if there was anyone there, but I acted as if there was. And the subject was the war on terror. So I thought I'd use that as my departure point for this speech this evening. There's no meaningful definition of the word terror or terrorism. The best I heard was from the late European intellectual, actor, filmmaker, writer, thinker, Peter Ustinov, who said this: "War is the terrorism of the rich and powerful, and terrorism is the war of the poor and powerless." In other words, the rich and powerful declare the violence of the poor and powerless to be terrorism, whilst their own violence is described as war. And I can't, for the life of me, see it that way. I can't make myself a distinction between acts of violence against innocent people, whether they're carried out by men in suits in Whitehall or the White House, or whether they're carried out by men with beards and turbans living in the Tora Bora in Afghanistan. It's a sin in any religion. It's a crime in any language to punish innocent people for the crimes of guilty people. That's why it was a big criminal act of terrorism to launch the war against Iraq, and the shock and awe which boomed on your television sets day after day, week after week, killing we knew not whom in the buildings being struck, as it was an act of criminal mass murder to blow up 55 people in the London Underground and on a London bus on the 7th of July last year. People die the same death, with red-hot, razor-sharp steel and sheets of flying glass, whether they're in Fallujah or in the London Underground. Whoever ordered the killing? All we say is that you cannot separate the appalling acts of individual terror, which are increasingly visited on Western targets, whether in Bali, aimed at Australian tourists, or in London on the Underground, or in America in the Twin Towers, from the political context in which they take place. Any criminologist knows this. Mr. Blair knew it. His election slogan in 1997 was that he would be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. He was declaring in that slogan that crimes have causes. Activities come from something. I said in the United States on the anniversary of 9/11 in New York that many people thought these aeroplanes which had struck the Twin Towers on 9/11 had come out of a clear blue sky. But in truth, they came out of a swamp of hatred and bitterness, constantly watered by the blood that flows from the policies of injustice and double standards in the West. These toxic phenomenon emerging from this swamp are multiplying, metamorphosing in many different forms, and are virulent yet, and will not be stopped by investing in fly swats. If you live beside a swamp, it doesn't matter how many fly swats you have. Doesn't matter how many anti-terrorism laws you pass, how many new policemen you hire, how good your Minister of Intelligence is, and you have a very good one here in South Africa. We don't, as it happens. The words British intelligence are becoming something of an oxymoron. The only way is to drain the swamp. To drain the swamp of that bitterness and hatred which is producing this toxicity by changing what we do and the way that we do it. And I'll come to the three most important issues that we have to address in that regard in a minute. But I want to make a point which I hope is to you self-evident. But I'm here to tell you, in the building in which I've sat for the last 20 years, in the British Parliament, the scene of many crimes,